Okay, students, for this Dewey-ing history debate, we're going to talk about territorial policies and specifically Puerto Rico. I'm going to start with this cartoon from 1900, Louis Darmal, titled The Ill-Fated Sister, A Case of Unjust Discrimination. Think about what we see happening in this cartoon. Maybe he looks familiar. That's President William McKinley. We've talked about Uncle Sam a number of times. Who is Uncle Sam? Who does he represent? And they're riding in this carriage that says free trade on it. Remember when we talked about trade policies, William McKinley was a big fan of tariffs and making goods from other countries pay a tariff. So who gets to participate in free trade with the rest of the United States? Who's sitting here? What's it say on her hat? So this territory, Hawaii, gets to participate in free trade. Who's this right here? What's it say on those rags? Puerto Rico? If Puerto Rico is a territory and Hawaii is a territory, why does Hawaii get to do this and Puerto Rico does not? Is this discrimination? We talked about just at the start of the year. Unjust discrimination means what? Think about how this situation with Puerto Rico might be related to a situation today also with Puerto Rico. Is Puerto Rico always treated the same as the other parts of the United States? After you've done your best to try and make a connection between the past and the present, generate a question about this document. What does it make you wonder? Through the assignment, we're going to be trying to decide if America's territories should be treated differently than other parts of America. So let's talk about one of those territories now, Puerto Rico. Where Puerto Rico is? It's just down here. Do any of you know what the actual status of Puerto Rico is? Remember that in our last assignment, we studied the Spanish-American War, and one of the consequences of the Spanish-American War when we signed that treaty was Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States. Since that time, in 1898, we've debated what their relationship is to the rest of the United States. It is still officially a territory, protectorate. Its status has changed since 1898. The two main policies have been debated include the classification of the islanders' citizenship. Are they citizens of the United States of America or citizens of Puerto Rico? At the end of the assignment, we'll talk about what the difference would be. And the status of the island. Should it become a state instead of just a territory? And some people debate complete independence. We're going to watch this video to learn about the status of Puerto Rico.
Because they're residents of a U.S. territory, when Puerto Ricans head to the island's polls on November 3rd, they will not be able to vote for the president. What they will be voting on is a referendum for Puerto Rican statehood and whether they should be admitted to the Union. In the last 4 years, Puerto Rico has had a $72 billion debt crisis, devastating hurricanes and earthquakes, and 500,000 Puerto Ricans have left for the U.S. mainland. All these factors are forcing a closer look at the relationship. NewsHour Weekend's Yvette Feliciano has more.
Colon represents Puerto Rico in Congress and is the first woman in history to hold the position.
Why we are fighting for equality and democracy around the world, but you still do have in your backyard.
Okay. So, what is the present situation related to Puerto Rico just described in the video? What did the newscaster tell us? What is Puerto Rico? What are they not? How does Puerto Rico feel about this? So the voters, early November, November 3rd, were trying to vote on what? What did they say in the news broadcast? They're going to the polls to vote on. So right now we're listening to Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. We need to find out why she thinks Puerto Rico should be a state. She already started talking about it.
The oldest colony, and that's Puerto Rico.
Her party, the New Progressive Party, currently holds the governorship on the island and organized the referendum for statehood.
And it will be the first time we'll have a direct question using the same model, the same ballot that was used in Alaska and Hawaii, and that should trigger a movement in Congress.
Trigger a movement because currently Gonzalez Colon has limited voting power in Congress, which she says serves as a metaphor for how the island's government operates under its current political status. Because Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory, Congress can override the island's laws, and Puerto Ricans receive disparate Medicaid and nutritional assistance funding.
More than 47.
So what did we just learn about Puerto Rico? They're not a state, are they? So as not a state, as just a territory, are they treated the same as the rest of the United States?
7% of the island is under the poverty level line. Most of them, women and children. And many of the reasons for this is that there are different kind of formulas for allocating funds to the territories.
And like millions of U.S. citizens who live on the 5 U.S. territorial islands, they cannot vote in the November presidential election.
Many Puerto Ricans have fought in all theaters of war. There's the blood of a lot of Puerto Ricans that came back in a casket with an American flag with 50 stars, but no one representing them.
In 2000,
How did what she just said explain why people support statehood for Puerto Rico?
In 2018, in response to the island's debt crisis, a congressionally appointed Fiscal Control Board announced sweeping austerity measures in Puerto Rico that slashed the local government's budget by a third. In July, the board suspended those cuts for 1 year as the territory struggles to recover from hurricanes, earthquakes, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Veronica Noriega Rodriguez and Amira O'Day are 2 climate activists in Puerto Rico.
We're going to be listening to these two to find out why people oppose worrying about the debate over statehood right now.
Es esta relación que nos impide a nosotros tomar nuestras propias decisiones.
This relationship stops us from making our own decisions about what affects us as Puerto Ricans. We feel powerless, and I'm speaking from my perspective as a youth. O'Day believes most mainland Americans don't understand the nuances of Puerto Rico's relationship to the U.S.
Like they always talk about poverty or corruption or in general just how bad things are here, but they never explain the historical causes of why that is.
Representative Gonzalez Colon has co-sponsored a bipartisan bill that calls upon Congress and the president to take action next year if Puerto Ricans vote for statehood in November. It will be the 6th time in history that Puerto Ricans vote on the question regarding the territory's relationship to the U.S.
It's not going to have any impact whatsoever.
Pedro Caban is a professor of Latin American, Caribbean, and U.S. Latino Studies at the University at Albany, who researches what he calls Puerto Rico's status as a colonial state. Caban says this year's status vote will not lead to a change for the territory, just like previous referendums.
I would argue that the fundamental objection to granting Puerto Rico statehood is the idea that Puerto Rico would attain remarkable political power. I think it would rank 16th among the 50 states.
With statehood, Puerto Rico would get 5 members in the House of Representatives and 2 senators. Gabon supports a different idea introduced in
So that idea the professor just discussed is important for today, but it's not as important for our case study, but I'll tell you about it anyway. The idea is if Puerto Rico becomes a state, Puerto Rico will get more representation in Congress. That includes in the Senate. And as he said, people think that that's going to give them lots of political power. If they elect Democrats, which people believe they would, that would give Democrats the majority in the Senate. And some people don't want to give the Democrats more political power. That's why they don't want Puerto Rico to become a state.
Congress last month by Democratic Congresswomen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Nidia Velázquez. They propose addressing Puerto Rico's political status by way of a constitutional convention.
There's nothing sacred that says that Puerto Rico has to be within the territorial clause of the Constitution.
In June, the Department of Justice declined to provide funding it had set aside for a Puerto Rican status referendum back in 2014, arguing the results of this year's referendum would favor statehood, since no other status options, such as independence, will be on the ballot. Although they're both critical of what they see as the island's colonial status, youth climate activists Ode and Noriega Rodriguez say the referendum is money wasted and a distraction from much more urgent matters in need of attention.
This is an important part to pay attention to.
We're in the middle of a pandemic with hundreds of people dying, thousands sick, and they're wasting millions in asking this question over and over again.
Right now, we youth are calling attention to the fact that Puerto Rico's landfills are being closed, and by 2022, we will have no place to put our trash. 3 years after Hurricane Maria, and you still see people with blue tarps on their homes. This is not the first time we've had a referendum on the colonial status, and it hasn't made a difference. We should be spending this money on necessary things, like fortifying our electrical system, which we need so desperately. Why spend the money on this referendum vote right now?
Because actually, that money is going to be an investment. This is like a gatekeeper for many other federal funds that we are not accessing now that can help not just the environment but many other areas. And when you're dealing with civil rights, it's not a money amount, it's not a dollar amount, it's about rights to the people, and that's you cannot measure that.
So, what we have here is a debate between people who think that we need to try our best to make sure Puerto Rico is treated equally with the other states by making them a state. There are other people who think that we've got other concerns for Puerto Rico. They've got bigger problems than worrying about whether or not they are treated equally. You're going to tell me whether or not you think we should make Puerto Rico a state. I'll tell you that that video was made before the November 3rd plebiscite, so we have the results of it. 52% of voters in Puerto Rico, so just those who voted, favored becoming a state. Now the decision is with the U.S. Congress. It doesn't matter how those voters voted, like the professor told us. No matter what, the decision is in Congress's hands. If they're going to become a state, it's only because Congress makes them a state. So the question is, do you think Congress should make Puerto Rico a state? Explain why. Now it's time to start our territorial policy case study. We're going to learn about Senate Bill 2264, Temporary Civil Government for Puerto Rico. This is not a misspelling. When we took Puerto Rico from Spain, we decided that apparently we should Americanize the spelling of Puerto Rico. So in 1898, you're going to see it called Puerto Rico because it's easier for us Americans to pronounce, apparently. So let's study this debate. Senate Bill 2264 to provide a government for Puerto Rico and for other purposes. Section 3. All inhabitants of Puerto Rico are now United States citizens. Section 4. Puerto Rico's laws shall remain unless they are changed by the United States military orders or conflict with America's laws. Section 8. Goods imported into Puerto Rico from the United States will pay 15% of the tariff rate paid by goods from other countries. Goods shipped from Puerto Rico to the United States will only pay 15% of the tariff rate paid by goods from other countries. This is important. When we studied tariffs, we learned that it's a tax on goods coming from other countries. If Puerto Rico is becoming part of the United States, why do they have to pay a tariff? Do other parts of the United States have to pay tariffs on goods coming from or to each other? Section 15. The governor of Puerto Rico shall be appointed by the president, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. How do we pick the governor where we live? The people vote, right? Who's going to pick the governor of Puerto Rico? Does that sound fair? Is that different? The president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, will appoint 10 people to, along with the governor, form an executive council. 5 members must be natives of Puerto Rico. So 10 people are going to be in charge. Only half of them have to be Puerto Rican? That all local laws shall be made by the Legislative Assembly of Puerto Rico. The Assembly will have 2 houses, one the Executive Council, and the other a House of Delegates. To be a delegate, one must be 25, must read and write either Spanish or English, and must own property in Puerto Rico. Section 29. All laws made by the Assembly shall be reported to the United States Congress, which has the power to annul those laws. This was something mentioned in that video. So Puerto Rico can make their own laws, but then they have to tell the Senate and the Congress about the law. And Congress can say, no thanks. They can annul it. They can undo those laws. Section 37. Every 2 years, the qualified voters of Puerto Rico shall choose one delegate to the House of Representatives of the United States who shall be entitled to a seat, but not a vote in that body. So they get to send somebody more or less just to watch. If they can't vote, do they have much importance in Congress? And Section 38. The President, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, will create a 3-person commission to review the laws of Puerto Rico. At least one member shall be a native citizen of Puerto Rico. Laws may be changed in order to secure and extend the benefits of a Republican form of government to all the inhabitants of Puerto Rico. So, overall, it looks like the United States is doing things to help set up a government in Puerto Rico. But how is Puerto Rico being treated? Are they going to be treated the same as the rest of the states? They're not even going to become a state. So what would lead to us having a debate over Puerto Rico becoming a part of the United States and how they should be treated as a part of the United States? We'll go way back to 1493 when Christopher Columbus made Puerto Rico a Spanish colony. In 1868, Puerto Ricans start trying to rebel against this Spanish rule known as the Ejército de Lares. When the Puerto Ricans were unsuccessful in their own rebellions, the leaders of the Revolutionary Party of 1898 decided to ask American President William McKinley in the United States to include Puerto Rico in their intervention the Senate was planning for Cuba. Remember, in our last case study, the United States was going to war with Spain over Cuba. Puerto Rico found out about this and said, hey, America, we want independence too. Why don't you help us? So it's important to know Puerto Rico was fighting for independence from Spain, and who's going to decide to help them? In April of 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain, and in July, American troops landed in Puerto Rico. By the end of August, the United States had driven the Spanish from the island and was in control. In December, the Treaty of Paris signed and is ratified by the Senate in February, giving the United States possession of Puerto Rico. From 1898 to 1900, the United States military governs Puerto Rico. So who was in charge of Puerto Rico the first couple years they were part of the United States? It wasn't the Puerto Ricans. We did give them freedom of assembly, speech, press, religion. We did open public schools. We did bring the postal service. We did a number of good things for Puerto Rico when we took over. I told you we also changed the name to Puerto Rico. In 1900, Serrano Payne from New York and Joseph Foraker from Ohio introduced bills to Congress to shape Puerto Rico's government. Foraker's bill is known as Senate Bill 2264. So what was going on at the time? Puerto Rico had fought for their independence from fill in the blank. Who helped them achieve their independence from Spain? But then, who becomes in charge? All of that should help you understand why we're debating the civil status, the legal status of Puerto Rico. We need to find out why people think these territories should be treated differently than the rest of the United States. We're going to look at this cartoon titled Our Christmas Tree from 1899. What kinds of things do we see hanging on the Christmas tree? Schools, some political stuff happening up there, police, technology, train, books, education. We have Uncle Sam and Columbia. Who are they handing all of these gifts to? What are the names of these children? Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba. These territories? I don't know if it's the Philippines. So what are the United States giving these territories? These, quote, gifts? They're talking about or showing these territories as children. As children, are they ready to be treated equally? How do some people think about the territories? Are they actually the same as the rest of the United States? You know, the girls in the video talked about how Puerto Rico had other things they needed to worry about. They didn't need to be treated equally right now. They need to have other things done for them. What's happening in this cartoon? They may not be treating them equally, but what are they helping them with? Consider that when trying to tell me what the main idea is and why that matters for today. So if some people believe Puerto Rico should not be treated the same because they're not ready for it and they have other things they need to worry about, we need to find out why some people think they should not be treated differently. We're going to read a letter from a Puerto Rican politician named Muñoz Rivera. He had been a politician in Puerto Rico when Spain was in charge, but then he left the government when the United States took over. He's going to explain why. When we read the text, highlight points he makes that sound sound like good reasons why Puerto Rico should be treated the same. The liberals of this country's mission is to help Puerto Rico. This includes fighting tyranny and threats of insulting despotism. Remember, they had just fought for their independence from Spain. Why do they still have to fight tyranny and despotism? Someone's in charge of them now. The American national anthem says this flag floats over the land of the free. What does that mean? If the American flag is flying above you, shouldn't you be free? If the American government upholds the great principle of American rights on the continent, it would be unfair to this tropical island where we happily welcomed America to destroy these rights under the flag's shadow. If the American flag stands for human rights, as to this, why are we not giving people equal rights? I left the government because the personality of our Puerto Rico was completely ignored. Puerto Rico should maintain its self-government like we had under Spain. To snatch from us what we had without giving us something equal or better is an offense against our people. Our search for a remedy should not be in Puerto Rico, but in Washington. From there, fair treatment must be found. So the United States can be on this island what they are on the continent: great, generous, and just. Puerto Rico should be a brother in the family and not a slave of the family. How should Puerto Rico be treated? What does this sentence mean? We ask for the President, the Congress, the press, and the public to not allow the enslavement of the whites after spilling so much blood to prevent the enslavement of the blacks. When he wrote this letter, it's only 35 years after the Civil War, where we ended slavery. What is he saying is happening to the white of Puerto Rico? He's comparing this civil status, this territorial status of Puerto Rico as enslavement. That doesn't sound good. So what ideas are most important here? Why does Munoz Rivera think that Puerto Rico should not be treated differently than the rest of the United States? And tell me why that matters for today's debate. Why do some people still believe Puerto Rico should be treated the same as all of the rest of the United States? So now we need to find out what policymakers decided to do, what the consequences of that decision were. We're down here. What were the results of the debate and what were the consequences? Sorry. The bill was passed on April 2nd, 1900. It was signed into law. It's known as the Foraker Act and the Organic Act. Why would America have decided to take over Puerto Rico? Why didn't they just let them go free? Well, we just fought this war that cost us $25 million. We lost 3,000 lives in the war against Spain. We just, quote, won Puerto Rico. Why should we give it up? The biggest difference between Senate Bill 2264, which we studied above, and the law that actually was put into place was the citizenship of the Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rico, and under Senate Bill 2264, all people living in Puerto Rico would become citizens of the United States. Under the Foraker Act, people living in Puerto Rico became citizens of Puerto Rico, and as such entitled to the protection of the United States. Because they weren't citizens of the United States, they were not given the same rights as American citizens. Can you imagine that Puerto Ricans, after fighting for their independence, are now upset that they're not being treated equally with the rest of the United States? This status lasts until 1917 when the Jones Act is signed. This made Puerto Rico an organized but unincorporated territory. One of the law's most biggest supporters was Puerto Rican resident commissioner Luis Munoz Rivera, who we heard from above. He originally favored Puerto Rican independence, but eventually settled for changes to Puerto Rican government. While he did no longer want them to become their own country, he did want Puerto Rico to have more say in what happened to Puerto Rico. We extend many constitutional rights to Puerto Rico, but not all of them. So since we signed the bill in 1900, there's just been an ongoing debate over what the status of Puerto Rico should be. The most important thing the Jones Act did was it revoked Puerto Rican citizenship and stated all Puerto Ricans are hereby declared and shall be deemed and held to be citizens of the United States. So at least now, and starting in 1916, Puerto Ricans were citizens or are citizens of the United States of America. I'm going to skip you ahead to more modern history. 47, United States Congress passed the Elective Governors Act, allowing Puerto Ricans to elect their own governor. President Harry Truman signed the act. So, for 47 years, the United States government had been picking their governor. Now they get to pick their own. That was an improvement, right? Just to give you an impression of how unhappy some Puerto Ricans are with this, their status, in 1950, two Puerto Rican nationalists from New York attempted to kill President Harry Truman to try and get independence. In 1954, 4 years later, Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire in the U.S. House of Representatives, wounding 5 congressmen. So clearly, some Puerto Ricans were not happy if they're turning to violence. In 1967, Puerto Ricans hold a first vote to decide whether or not they should become independent, they should stay what they were, they should become a state. These are the results. 60% of people in 1967 decided to stay as they were. Almost 40% wanted statehood. Only 1% wanted independence. So clearly the majority of people liked being part of the United States. But they can't quite agree on how they should be treated as a part of the United States. We had another referendum in 1991, another in 1993, and we have another in 1998, then in 2017, and most recently in 2020. So clearly, since they became an American territory in 1900, there's been no real agreement that what they are is good enough. People continue to debate what the status should be, and that's what you're going to be doing now. Before we make that policy advice, we need to compare and contrast the two debates. So the similarity is we're talking about Puerto Rico, right? And their status. What status were we debating in the past? More or less, who should be in charge of the Puerto Rican government? How should they be treated? What about today? What is it some Puerto Ricans want Puerto Rico to become? Once again, for this assignment, I'll make the policy advice extra credit. Try and think about, based on our past evidence, whether or not Puerto Rico should be admitted to the United States as a state. Should Puerto Rico get equal representation in Congress? Should Puerto Rican citizens feel that they are the same as the rest of the United States?